Then I'd like to introduce our speakers today. So first we have Hannah Simonson, who is president of the Northern California Chapter Board, and she's also an architectural historian at Page and Turnbull. Then we have Cord Struckman, an architect and a member of our board, and Chad DeWitt. He is an architect and an owner of a sea ranch property, and his firm is also currently restoring another sea ranch property.
Thanks, Andrea. Cool. I think we're gonna jump right in. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's exciting to see a bunch of folks from other states and all across the country. That's really cool. So this is the 1970s Turn 50, a virtual tour of Northern California. For those of you who aren't as familiar with us and our organization, we are the Northern California chapter of Docomomo US, which is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the documentation and conservation of building sites and neighborhoods of the modern movement. We've been doing this for almost 25 years now. We're really excited to be participating in Tour Day, which is an annual event hosted by Docomomo US. So if you haven't already signed up for some of the other virtual tours and events that are happening, definitely take advantage of the fact that those are virtual this year, and you can join a bunch of different regional chapters across the country. And we want to say thanks, of course, to all of our members, and for non-members, thanks to you as well. Your ticket fees today are going to our annual student or emerging scholar travel grant for the annual Docomomo US Symposium, which is slated to take place in Chicago later in 2021. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand it over to Cord to talk about some efforts we've been making recently related to the 70s.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. So all of the 5 buildings that you see today are on this map, the 1970s Turn 50 map. You can access this through our website. And the idea of this map is to provide an overview to really build more awareness of buildings from the 1970s here in Northern California. So over the last month, our group did a lot of research, read books, buildings we knew, online archives, databases, etc., and gathered by now what we have about 180 buildings from the 1970s here on this map. As you see on the left side, so they're listed there with the address, with the architect, some pictures, and also some background information. So it's interesting to check this out. It is a living document. We don't claim that this is the 1970s map, so we are doing updates. And if you feel we missed any buildings or there are any kind of omissions, please use the form on our website to really share your feedback with us. So check out your neighborhood, check it out when you go on your next hike, and see what is around in your neighborhood from the 1970s. Thanks.
Thanks, Cord. Yeah, this was a really fun project to work on, and it was definitely enlightening for all of us. We definitely all learned some new things and discovered some new buildings. So it was really cool, and we're really excited to share a couple of those with you today. Just to kind of set the stage, set the tone for the 1970s. Some of you may remember the 1970s. Other of us, I think we have gotten a taste of the 1970s through plenty of pop culture over the years, but this was definitely a kind of interesting decade, a lot of socio-political turmoil and anxiety, in addition to disco, shag carpet, bell bottoms, all of that. There also are a lot of political and social movements, many of which kind of came out of the later 60s and are continuing into the 70s, protests against Vietnam War, civil rights movements, so on. Also, of course, we had the Watergate scandal, several different oil crises. Apple Computer was founded, so there's like a burgeoning kind of tech industry coming along. Also in 1970 was the first Earth Day, And so that kind of marks a moment in which the country is starting to recognize the impact, human impact on the environment, and starting to think about sustainability and climate change and so on. Also in the 70s, 1976 was the American Bicentennial. So that there are a bunch of celebrations around that. And I think that kind of momentum also kind of helped spur the burgeoning historic preservation movement, which was becoming professionalized in the 70s. So all of these things are kind of like happening in the background and also informing architecture, the built environment, and sort of design aesthetics as well. Here in Northern California, a lot of our most iconic modernist buildings were built in the 70s, actually. The Transamerica Pyramid, of course, is iconic on the San Francisco skyline. In addition, the Embarcadero Center by John Portman, you can see the first of those buildings here, and the hotel down here. The Hilton Hotel, originally a Holiday Inn hotel, which we'll talk about. In addition to this kind of downtown, kind of late modernist urban development, we're also seeing a lot of kind of suburban office parks down in Silicon Valley. As I mentioned, Apple Computer is founded. There's a lot of growth down in the kind of aerospace and electronics. But in addition to these kind of more late modernist buildings, we're also seeing a lot of more kind of soft, organic, vernacular influences with the Sea Ranch and Third Bay tradition, especially in residential projects. And even the beginnings of some kind of postmodernist and historicist influences in the later 70s. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in San Francisco and in Northern California, the Bay Area in general. So just to kind of set that stage a little bit more, I'm gonna run through a couple of different architectural styles that we were seeing in Northern California in the 70s as we were creating this map and doing research. And I think kind of the overarching point here is that there's a lot of different stuff going on. There's definitely kind of divergence in architectural styles in the 1970s. There's some reactions to modernism, as well as sort of a kind of splintering of different kind of new trends within the sort of larger umbrella of modernism. So there's a lot of interesting and different stuff happening in the 1970s. So of course, we're still seeing some really great examples of brutalism here in Northern California in the 70s. This is the Glen Park BART station, completed in 1973. In the 1970s is when our BART station, or our BART system, finally opened after a few decades of planning and construction. Of course, late modernism, I touched on that briefly. This is the Embarcadero Center by John Portman. This kind of later modernism, definitely a continuation of the modern movement, proliferates in urban downtowns, but also in more suburban kind of corporate office parks. We're seeing kind of a heavier material palette and a lot of kind of exaggerated repetition of form in these buildings. This example is the IBM Santa Teresa laboratory down in San Jose, another interesting example. New formalism, this is an interesting kind of subgenre style, definitely within kind of the trends of modernism, but introducing some kind of stripped classical forms such as columns and arcades, as you see here. In some examples, we see a lot more high-end finishes. This little theater at Stonestown in San Francisco is not super high-end materials, but you do see that kind of cool column arcade. We also are seeing some kind of interesting, more like hippie outsider architecture in the 1970s. This is a really cool example of a house by Valentino Agnoli. I wasn't very familiar with him until we started this research, but he has done some really interesting projects. So we're seeing some kind of more organic forms, kind of perhaps in the line of architects like Bruce Goff and more fluid, softer materials here. And kind of relatedly, the Third Bay tradition, this is a regional style of modernism that follows, there's logically a first bay and a second bay and then a third bay tradition. So the Third Bay tradition arguably kind of arises in the 60s with projects like Sea Ranch and continues through the 70s, maybe even into the 80s. But definitely born out of local materials, thinking about local environmental conditions, and also bringing in some vernacular forms and influences. Also in the 70s, we see some kind of new ways of thinking about modernism. So high-tech structuralism, I think, kind of fits within that. Probably the most iconic example internationally is the Pompidou in Paris. Definitely thinking about modernist principles, emphasizing new technology, use of module structural systems. Some of those mirror glass buildings that you see, especially in Southern California, would probably fit into this category. We'll talk about the Larkspur Ferry terminal in more detail later. And of course, we do start to see the early beginnings of postmodernism in the 1970s. I think it becomes more mainstream in the 1980s, but, and I think we can't say that there's one version of postmodernism. There are many different subgenres even within postmodernism, but generally the movement is kind of born out of a reaction to modernism and its sort of perceived failings. And there's a lot of interest in kind of rhetoric and symbolism and conveying meaning through architecture. A lot of that comes in the form of using, columns and classical features, but there's also some interesting examples that kind of rely on clever humor as a way of conveying this type of meaning. The best products showroom in Sacramento by site was one of a series of projects that they did. This one was in Sacramento that I think is really interesting and clever. This little corner piece actually is on tracks, and at night it would be pushed in and closed, and then in the morning it would be rolled out, and this kind of reveals the entrance to the store. Sadly, this building was demolished in the 90s, so it's no longer with us. But and of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is definitely like a moment of a lot of political and environmental activism, and this does find its way into architectural design. A lot of the work remains kind of what we call paper architecture, so it's it never, it's drawn out, but it never leaves the page to be built in reality, but that's not always the case. And one interesting example is Ant Farm, which was a radical architecture collective that started in San Francisco, and they toured with these inflatables. And this inflatable was actually installed at Sproul Plaza at UC Berkeley at the first Earth Day as a commentary on environmental degradation and air pollution. So this is kind of an interesting example of that trend. And of course, again, kind of related, this new interest in sustainable and green architecture, which really takes off in the decades to follow. In 1978, California's Governor Jerry Brown, during his first term, instituted the first strong energy efficient building code, Title 24, and this kind of signals a shift in political will to address environmental issues through policy changes. And this new policy was kind of monumentalized in the built environment with the new energy efficient office building program in Sacramento. And this is the Bateson building in Sacramento that was part of that project or program. It was completed in 1981, but designed and largely built in the 70s. So I did kind of sneak that one in here. So that was kind of a high level overview of a lot of different things and a lot of different terms, but we want to dive in and share a few specific examples in more detail with you. So these are going to be our...
Before we jump into our first stop, we have a question from Petra Marar about heightened geometry in this decade. She noted that there's interesting geometry in New Formalism and the roof pitch / angle in the Third Bay tradition. Do you have any, or Cord or Chad, do you have any comments about the heightened geometry that we saw in those examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think with New Formalism, there's kind of an interest in, a lot of times New Formalism is used in like governmental and institutional buildings. So I think that some of this like emphasis on geometry and bringing in the arcades and columns gives the spaces more of a sense of grandeur and formalism. So there's definitely like that kind of thought process there. So kind of for the same reasons that those types of geometries were used in earlier styles. And but with the Third Bay tradition, I think it's maybe kind of a different thinking. I think there's, in the Third Bay tradition and in later kind of postmodernism, there's a lot of thinking about kind of complex interior volumes and how you can create kind of like a three-dimensional experience of space inside the volume. And I think that we'll see some interesting examples, an interesting example of that at the Mentzer house in Sea Ranch. So that might illuminate it even a little further.
I'll be sure to speak to that. This is Chad. I'll be sure to speak to where that roof pitch at least started in Sea Ranch and go from there.
Great. A perfect segue. So we have a couple of stops. We're going to go to the Hilton Hotel and Chinese Cultural Center in San Francisco, the Larkspur Ferry Terminal up in Marin County, the Mentzer House in Sea Ranch up here, and then all the way down to Kresge College in Santa Cruz, and then back to San Francisco with the Cesar Chavez Student Union. So we've got some fun places to hit. So we're going to start with the Hilton Hotel and Chinese Cultural Center. This is a project in downtown San Francisco, kind of right at the edge of where Chinatown meets the financial district. This is Portsmouth Square here, and this is the Hilton Hotel. Some of you who are from San Francisco or have been to San Francisco may recognize these spaces. The Transamerica Pyramid is just over here, and North Beach is kind of right up here. This building was designed by the Chinese American architect Clement Chen Jr. This is definitely very much within the brutalist style. It's a 27-story hotel building that was completed in 1971, originally a Holiday Inn, but now a Hilton Hotel. And if you joined our tour day last year in person, we started at this building. So you may recognize it if you were able to join us then. So Clement Chen Jr. was born in Shanghai and then moved to the US in 1949 to study architecture. And then he moved to San Francisco and ended up working with a bunch of the big names in architecture in the Bay Area at the time. So he worked with Mario Ciampi, Anshin and Allen, Edward Durrell Stone, William Worcester. And after kind of gaining some experience, he started his own firm, Clement Chen and Associates, in 1964. And the firm would do a number of residential projects, but they really became best known for their hotel projects. He worked frequently with Holiday Inn and designed hotels for them in Pasadena, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Palo Alto, in addition to this one in San Francisco. And here we can kind of see the building in 1973, just a couple years after its construction, and here's Clement Chen himself. This project came out of a design competition that was hosted by the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency for a site that previously had the Hall of Justice until the 50s. And what was kind of interesting about this site was in 1963, a local activist, J.K. Choi, kind of caught wind of the city's plan for this site and countered with a proposal for a Chinese cultural center or museum that would be constructed on that site to serve the Chinatown community. And there was quite a bit of back and forth between Choi and his organization and the city, and eventually somewhat of a compromise was reached, and they, the city went ahead with commissioning this hotel project, but there was an agreement that a Chinese cultural center would be, there would be a space within the hotel building for this cultural center. Here we can see a couple of alternate designs that were in the kind of final couple of proposals for that design competition. And then on the right, we see Clement Chen's winning proposal, and it looks a little bit different than what was actually constructed. And within this letter to the editor from Clement Chen, he's talking about how this design was actually somewhat inspired by a Chinese Tang Dynasty stele monument. So, and this is a picture of a Tang Dynasty stele. So you can kind of see some of the resemblance. So even though this is definitely a clearly modernist design, there are some references to historic architecture and design here, which is kind of interesting. Of course, the design did change a little bit by the time it was constructed, and so that overhanging kind of top piece actually didn't make it into the final built project. So we've lost a little bit of that reference to that Tang Dynasty stele, but we can see some of the key features of brutalism here. This is a raw concrete building. Brutalism, generally understood to be derived from the French term béton brut, which means raw concrete. And if you have a chance to go visit this building in person, once you get up close to it, you'll see there's a really nice, interesting texture from the board formwork that's used to pour the concrete. That texture is there in the concrete exposed. And then another key feature of this building is how you can kind of read the function of the building from the exterior. So this kind of flared base is where all the public or semi-public functions happening, the lobby, the restaurant, bar, conference rooms, and the cultural center. And then as it tapers up, these are kind of the standardized hotel rooms. And then these two kind of column pieces are the elevator cores. And in this photo, we don't see the pedestrian bridge, but there was a pedestrian bridge designed and constructed that connects Portsmouth Square, which is kind of the heart of Chinatown, the key, like kind of main public open space in Chinatown. And that bridge connects directly to where the cultural center is within the building. So there's definitely some kind of clear symbolism there, as well as kind of providing a functional connection. These are photos from the opening of the cultural center in 1973. So this was definitely a win for Choi and those activists. And the cultural center continues to operate today. Of course, with COVID, I don't think it's currently open to the public, but they do continue to have events and lots of programming there. And another fun fact about the pedestrian bridge before we continue on is that the bridge is known as China Banks within the skateboarding community, and this is kind of an iconic skateboarding site. So much so that they recreated a version of it during the Do Tour, which I guess is a skateboarding event, in front of City Hall here in 2012. So that's a fun fact. Before we go on to Larkspur Ferry Terminal, if there are any questions about the Hilton Hotel, I can answer them now, or if they come to you, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we can circle back to them later. Okay. I don't think I see any. So, oh, I do see one. So the question is about how the design was received within the community. Brutalism tends to have a lot of strong opinions. Yeah, this is true. Interestingly, we haven't come across any like extreme reactions to the brutalist style of the building. I think that there was a lot of conversation and back and forth about whether or not this site should be a hotel or whether it should be a site that serves the community. So I think that the conversation was more about that than the architectural style. But like I said, there was this kind of compromise reach with the cultural center being included within the hotel project. So I think that people were excited about that. And that was kind of the primary focus of the discussions. And then there's a question about what the current status of the building is. The building is still a hotel and continues to operate as such. There have been some kind of minor alterations to the lobby entrance and the space kind of below the bridge, but otherwise the building is like very much as it was designed originally. We have heard some rumors about discussions about demolishing the bridge though, which there's some, I think, concerns about whether or not it's like very functional or people actually use it. And there's some people who don't like the fact that lots of skateboarders use it. But I think it's a cool and integral part of the design. So we're definitely going to keep an eye on that discussion. All right, I'm going to take us up to Larkspur next. So the Larkspur Ferry Terminal is, of course, in Larkspur, which is in Marin County, just north of San Francisco, across the bay. This is a ferry terminal that serves the ferry transit system. This is a kind of commuter ferry line between San Francisco and Marin County and the rest of the bay. This is kind of important to know because Marin County and Larkspur don't have the BART system, our kind of subway underground system. So a lot of people do commute by ferry or did commute by ferry. So this building was constructed in the early 70s. And I really like this spread from this architectural publication, The Artful Design of a Non-Building. So kind of the interesting thing to note about this building or non-building is that it's a large space frame structure. So there's not enclosed interior space. So it's really kind of a large cover and kind of an open space below. So here we can kind of see another view of it. This is from a feature in Architectural Record about the terminal. So you can kind of really see the space frame structure here. And a space frame is basically like a three-dimensional truss system. So it's a rigid, lightweight system that's composed of interlocking struts, which are basically those metal bars that are that make up the entire structure. So the benefit of these structures is that they can span pretty large areas with fewer kind of vertical supports. And in theory, they can be more economical in terms of cost and materials. In this diagram, you can see that the struts or the bars form these tetrahedrons, which are essentially like a pyramid shape. and that module is repeated throughout the structure. I think one of the selling points of using a space frame structure on this particular site is the lightweight construction method. The site is basically mud fill. So it would be much more challenging to have a really heavy concrete brutalist building, for example, on this site. Perhaps not impossible, as much of San Francisco is constructed on fill, but there is a benefit to having this lightweight structure. So the Larkspur Ferry Terminal was designed by a local Northern California firm, Braccia, DeBreer, and Hegland. I may have butchered any part of that name, but Jacques DeBreer was a project designer for the terminal, and he worked with Kaiser engineers on the structural design, and the landscape architects for the project were Royston, Hanamoto, Beck, and Abbey, which is a landscape architecture firm here in the Bay Area that, I mean, they worked with all the big names, but they also are known for their work with Joseph Eichler. That's probably one of the collaborations that they're best known for. So here you can kind of see how the building is functioning in plan, or kind of bird's eye view. So we see that there's two ferry docks on either side, and then additional one over here. And I like this photo because you can see how the roof of the structure kind of has this like billowing quality, almost like ship sails or something like that. Yeah, so just DeBreer and his firm are not a super well-known firm around the Bay Area, but he was born in Brussels, but grew up in Santiago, Chile, and then moved to LA when he was kind of pretty young, and then got his degree from USC, and then got a master's at UC Berkeley, and continued to lecture at Berkeley's College of Environmental Design into the 1990s, I believe. So they're definitely not a household name around Northern California, but we're starting to learn a little bit more about them. And another kind of important project that they worked on was the Santa Rosa City Hall. This is definitely more of a brutalist concrete structure, which kind of brings me to where were the information or inspirations and kind of source materials for this space frame structure that they implemented in Larkspur. People may know of Buckminster Fuller, Bucky Fuller. He was an architect, theorist, mathematician, kind of well known for his use of geodesic domes, which are essentially like a spherical space frame kind of structure. Louis Kahn and his collaborator and partner Ann Ting also were thinking about space frames as early as the 50s and into the 60s. But these kinds of space frame structures, and actually this one that Ann Ting did, you can kind of see some kind of striking similarities to the Larkspur Ferry Terminal. But yeah, so these like kind of radical, scientifically minded design approaches were definitely becoming more popular in the 1960s, along with this kind of like growing hippie movement, but also kind of thinking about space exploration and kind of like high tech uses of design, you know, how would we build in space and so on. And along those lines, I think that kind of radical future-minded thinking is definitely seen at Expo 70 in Osaka, in Japan. This was a World's Fair exposition that was held in 1970. And you can see a lot of this like really radical space age design and kind of metabolist style design. And actually one of the kind of big, exciting things to visit at the Osaka Expo 70 was this exhibit that had a bunch of moon rocks that Neil Armstrong had brought back from the moon landing, which had only happened a few months earlier in July of 1969. So definitely that excitement is kind of being seen in these like built works. And the theme pavilion, which was kind of the main structure at Osaka, is this giant space frame structure. And I don't know if any of these architects went to Osaka, but certainly Buckminster Fuller and Lucan and Anting's work would have been widely published at the time, and Osaka Expo 70 was also widely published in architectural magazines and journals at the time. So these are definitely like in the air, people are aware of them and are thinking about them. So back in Larkspur, I think it's pretty clear that these influences are coming into play. Here you can kind of see how this structure, it has a triangle plan and then also these kind of triangle pyramidal footings as well. So it's 192 feet on each side and then kind of tapers down into these 3 inverted pyramid legs. And then there's, I think, about a 1,600 square foot open deck below. So viewed above, either in plan or kind of this bird's eye view, you can see how that triangle partie like really informs the whole site, as well as the main space frame building. So you see these kind of like triangles showing up all around the design. Some of that has been lost over time, changes to circulation and parking and so on, but you can kind of see it strongly in these early plans. So interesting, we're gonna kind of see a video of what this looked like at today. When the building was constructed, the Chronicle's architecture reviewer, Alan Temko, called the building a lucid structure, immaculate and radiant as a vision of Buckminster Fuller, but added that it was superficially handsome, a symbol of how much can go wrong in big bureaucratic technical fantasies. So he's on the one hand, really impressed with the design, but also there were some kind of early functional issues with the building. The kind of design brief from the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District asked for an open structure that would cover a large area. And that is what was delivered by the architects. But as soon as it went into use, users were complaining of wet winds and fog. Anyone who lives in the Bay Area will be unsurprised by that. So kind of pretty quickly, they had to add in some of these concrete and kind of plexiglass barriers. So that kind of muddles up the simplicity of the design, but addresses some of these kind of functional concerns. That being said, the project was awarded the AIA Award of Honor for Design Excellence and the American Institute of Steel Construction Award, which we see in this spread here. This is from 1977. And interesting to note, this is the Larkspur Ferry Terminal here, and right next to it is the Concord Pavilion by Frank Gehry. So this is a kind of earlier Frank Gehry project before he was very famous. So it's kind of cool to see those side by side, in addition to some other space frames and other cool buildings from that era. Yeah, so that is the Larkspur Ferry Terminal. I don't know if anyone has questions about Larkspur right now.
Yeah, we have a question about the current condition and maintenance of the Larkspur Terminal.
Yeah, so it's, I think that in that film, you can kind of see that, you know, there have been some kind of changes over time. The structure itself is still like very much there and in use. And I think that most of the changes have been to kind of the site around the structure itself. So the structure is still very much there, but I think like many public transit infrastructure agencies, there is some lack of maintenance. So you could see it could probably use like a nice power washing. But if you do take the ferry, you are able to visit the ferry terminal even today during COVID. So definitely if you're in the area, I'd recommend going to check it out in person. Great, well, I'm going to hand it off to Chad, who's going to take us further up the coast to Sea Ranch.
Hi, everyone. Sea Ranch, as I would imagine many of you know, is, go ahead with the next slide, is a amazing, really incredible utopian community that was conceived by Al Boki for a piece of property that was formerly a ranch on the Sonoma coast near the Mendocino border. It was a sheep ranch. The Al Boki, an architect himself, brought in many of some of the local architects of the day in the Bay Area. Joseph Esherick, as an example, he would have been the dean of architecture, but he brought in Lawrence Halprin, and then a young firm called MLTW, which is Charles Moore, Donlin Linden, William Turnbull, and Richard Whitaker. And they were kind of the younger firm that the commission was divided up, with Halprin subdividing the properties, and the architects, Esherick doing the lodge and the store and some of the original model homes, along with MLTW doing some of the very famous, the condominiums. If you could move to the next slide. All of Sea Ranch was done very much in a response, what Sea Ranchers call as a limited partnership with the land. So they love to say sort of living lightly on the land, and that was definitely the purchase of this property, and the ideas behind this community was to preserve the natural environment and create a language of, it was a new town development of the time, and it was to create an architecture that had a language that really blended in with the surroundings, and kind of highlighted rather than, highlighted the nature rather than drawing attention to itself. Go ahead to the next slide. This spawned, this began in 1960, the planning started in 1963, and the condominium was finished in about 1965. And this spurred what is now called the Third Bay tradition, which is our regional Northern California style of modernism. And it is the mix of modern and vernacular styles. It's definitely takes, it's a wood type construction, both in its cladding, which would be cedar or redwood, and it is also very much a reaction at Sea Ranch initially to the environment. The 4 and 12 roof pitch came as a result of lots of wind tunnel tests, because the coastal winds are just absolutely relentless. And then the materials locally were abundant. So with redwood, stands of redwoods easily milled into lumber, the homes became to look the way that they do now, which is somewhat ubiquitous throughout the world. Go ahead to the next slide. So we'll start with the Mentzer house. The Mentzer house was designed 5 years after the condominium, when Turnbull and Charles Moore were in partnership. Donlin Linden and Richard Whitaker had gone to the East Coast for teaching positions, and at this point, Charles Moore is actually in New Haven, the Dean of Architecture there at Yale. So from the research that I've done, this house is pretty much Charles Moore. I'm sorry, not Charles Moore, Turnbull in its design and conception. And this was a single family home conceived as a weekend home in the Redwoods, so on the eastern side of the highway. Go ahead to our next slide. Some really beautiful exteriors. You can see here that they're really quite understated with redwood. It's a singular volume that incorporates basically the rooms, the living spaces, the bedrooms, the kitchen at an opposite end, and then creates some what they called saddlebag bays, which would be areas for seating and taking in views. And as those public spaces expand, we'll go ahead on to the next slide. So this is our video that we took of the house, and you can see the redwood siding. The entryway going in is done at an angle, and it's kind of a hint. Turnbull's giving us a hint of sort of what's to become, and that he kind of sort of breaks all the rules and is very much more expressive on the inside. This home, I can't stress how simple it is. And it was done partially before to keep the construction costs down. But also just part of Turnbull's genius is really to kind of have that idea, the notion of one idea and stick with that idea. And in this particular home, that idea is to be expressive with the structural system. And you can see these boxed in trusses up above with the Douglas fir tongue and groove that is, if you notice, is unfinished. Galvanized barn hardware for the doors. And just very sort of straightforward, but also playful in the way he works with the lighting and with the bays coming in at angles. Just a really beautiful, well-designed, straightforward home using local materials that at the time were very abundant and easily to get, but just carefully and thoughtfully put together. So the views, and you can see the current redwoods in the space, and his use of lighting in a very playful way. Courtney Applebaum has done the interiors on this, and she's done a great job with the sheepskin seating area and some of the more vintage furniture. You can also see some of the natural light that he's coming in. He's bringing it in between some of the structural members. And this is a theme in Turnbull's architecture, where he really plays with natural light at the time in some very unexpected ways. So are there any questions on this particular home? I don't see any. It's a unique opportunity to see these homes. Sea Ranch is an incredibly private community, and these homes are often not open to the public. So I was really excited to be able to share with you this home that we're currently working on and bringing back to its original state. So I'll hand it off to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, that was a really unique and exciting opportunity to see the inside of this house. And I'll just give a shout out of thanks to a great friend of Docomomo Noka, Jack McCarthy, who took the video for that house. And thanks to Chad for getting us access to the interior. Very, very cool. And this is a great transition to our next site, which is Kresge College. We're traveling all the way back down to kind of the more southern limits of what we consider Northern California to Santa Cruz. But this project was also done by MLTW and with Charles Moore and William Turnbull, completed just shortly after in 1974. So Kresge College, Charles Moore, excuse me, and William Turnbull were both principals in charge on this project. But I think that we see a lot more of Moore's hand in this project. It's a residential college, part of the UC Santa Cruz system. And it's an 8-acre site. One of several residential colleges at UC Santa Cruz. And kind of the interesting kind of overarching concept of Kresge College is really a divergence away from more properly institutional buildings, as this quote says. So instead of the kind of manicured lawn and quad that you might expect at a college campus and lots of like formal geometry, Kresge College is really taking its influences more from like a Mediterranean village or like an Italian hill town, but set in this really unique redwood forest setting. So instead of really like formal angled paths and so on, you get this kind of informal crisscrossing and kind of intimate network of kind of paths or streets throughout this college. It was an award-winning project, featured in a number of prominent magazines at the time. Here we're looking at some photos and spreads from Progressive Architecture. And in this site plan, I think you get a really good sense of how the campus layout is responding to the hilly site, and also creating these like really intimate spaces for gathering and social interaction, and creating these kind of interesting processional paths and kind of views between buildings and through the trees. So here on the cover, you're kind of looking through an opening into one of the paths, and you can kind of see partly where the path is going and it disappears. And so there's some kind of like interesting playing with kind of views and like hiding and revealing things as you move through the space. As I mentioned, it's built into an existing redwood forest in the hills above the Pacific coast. And so you can kind of see how that topography and existing forest is really informing the design here. Definitely an intentional move away from these like institutional kind of mega structures that are being built on other campuses in the late 60s and early 70s. And I love these drawings. I think color pencil for these ones, you can really get like a flavor of the 70s era and like aesthetic here. We got some like bell-bottom pants and some nice colorful attire, but also I think here what they're trying to indicate is also how these intimate spaces are kind of informing the social, like the ideal kind of social construct of these residential, like smaller residential campuses. So where Moore's work with MLTW and William Turnbull at Sea Ranch fits within that Third Bay tradition, or really kind of started off the Third Bay tradition, Kresge College is kind of this turn a little bit more towards postmodernism with these references to the classic Italian hill town. They're wood frame buildings rendered in stucco cladding, and then kind of this use of really exuberant primary color paint and kind of super graphics throughout. Perhaps some of this is inspired with the collaboration from Sea Ranch, though, with Bobby Stoffacher-Salomon, who was the graphic designer who did a bunch of the super graphics at MLTW's recreation center at Sea Ranch. But so we see a lot of that really fun kind of play of color. Although the buildings are mostly white, you get these little pops of color and different graphics throughout. So you can see here that there's more of a use of kind of like quotation or kind of reference to some more kind of historic or different kind of forms here. Chad gave us a little bit of background on Moore and Turnbull. Just to build on that a little bit, Moore graduated from University of Michigan in the 40s and then went on to Princeton to get his master's and PhD. He TA'd for Louis Kahn while he was there, and while he was at Princeton, he met Robert Venturi, who's kind of the prominent theorist and architect who kind of set off this postmodern movement beginning in the late 60s, but into the 70s. And then he also met Donlin Linden and William Turnbull. And when he moved to the Bay Area to take a job at Berkeley in the late 50s, he formed the practice MLTW with them. And he later went on to teach at Yale, UCLA, and UT Austin. By the time this project was completed, I think he was at Yale by then. And it's just interesting to note that he taught at all of these different institutions, because in addition to him forming different architectural firms in each city that he moved to teach, and constructed projects in all of those cities, so he was influential in that way, but he also, taught students across the country and was very influential in the kind of upcoming generations of architects at that time. I think what's really unusual about Kresge College for this period is that the dorms are co-ed, and also that the residential spaces occupy the same buildings as classrooms and even professors' offices. So this is a really unique approach, and kind of the layout and design of Kresge College itself really reinforces these values of integrated living and kind of learning while promoting social interaction and kind of community building. The project was completed in 1974, as I mentioned. So it's being designed and constructed during kind of the height of the 1973 oil embargo crisis, during a period of pretty extreme recession and inflation in the US and worldwide, really. So the UC system, like many places, was cutting budgets for capital projects and maintenance. And the college was constructed using kind of economic materials. And there was some thought that the design might save on maintenance costs by eliminating interior corridors from the residential buildings. You can kind of see these exterior corridors here. And some like interesting views. These photos were taken in the 70s, I believe, or possibly 80s, but pretty soon after the building was constructed, or the project was constructed. So along those lines, and to preemptively respond to any questions about how this site is doing in terms of existing status or condition. Unfortunately, there was deferred maintenance and probably, maybe not as much investment as was needed to upkeep all of these buildings. So at this point, there is a renewal project to address some of those concerns, to refurbish some of the existing buildings, but also to improve accessibility on the site. Built in 1974, obviously this is pre-ADA, and it's a pretty complex hilly site. So I think that there were a number of accessibility concerns. And then also you see Santa Cruz wants to add some additional buildings to meet 21st century needs and increase capacity and some other things. So many of the iconic spaces, such as the main kind of piazza and mayor's stand and the waterfall steps, are supposed to be retained, but this project is already underway, and I believe that the town hall building has already been demolished, and there's construction going on site. There was a pretty major wildfire near UC Santa Cruz over this summer. We are pretty confident that none of the buildings at UC have been impacted by that, but I believe that kind of impacted the construction schedule for this project. So not sure how that will impact the completion of their project. But that is Kresge College.
Are there any questions?
Oh, I see
Andrea
one.
Hannah, before we go to the next one.
Yeah, I see one that UCSC referred to these as cluster colleges with living and learning in one area. One UCSB grad here who found this a total turnoff. Yeah, so I guess some people like this and some people don't. Definitely like a unique style of living. I went to a really small school, so I don't know. I can kind of see the appeal of this, but I'm sure it has its challenges or drawbacks for certain things. So be curious to hear more about that. All right, Cord, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. So here for the last one, we are coming back to San Francisco to another college, this time the San Francisco State University and its Cesar Chavez Student Center. This might be a building that not even many people in San Francisco are familiar with because it sits quite in the center of the campus, so it's not visible from any kind of public street. It was completed in 1975, and the architect was Peffert Keating Clay. Here you see how it looked in 1975. So as a student center, so the uses were kind of a student bookstore, cafes, assembly rooms, and offices. And in this use, it continues its use until today. It is relatively well maintained, though there were some alterations in the mid-90s that changed the appearance of the buildings, and we will see this later. It is publicly accessible. The interior, of course, is currently closed, but you can tour the outside of the building. So next slide, please. So while it was completed in 1975, the history goes all the way back to 1966, when the first architectural competition was launched. That was won by Moshe Safdie, a very young 28-year-old architect. You see the design here at the top, because it sits at a very central location of the campus. So he designed this house without a front door. So a building that you can approach from many different sides, can go up, can go down on this building, basically like an artificial hill here in San Francisco. But with many winning designs, it didn't really get realized. While the professional, public, and also the students were really in favor of this design, the Board of Trustees didn't really approve it. And there was some other unrest. I mean, it was like 67, 68, so it was a very rebellious time at the colleges nationwide. So the design was scrapped, and another competition was held in 68, 69 with the other finalists. This one was won then by Peffert Keating Clay. You see the design here. Very iconic design. So you don't see any spaces basically, because there are 2 floors of all the rooms below grade. So the ground floor is kept very, very open. So you can enter the building from many different sides. And this iconic volume really centers the building. Next slide, please, Hannah. So Peffert Keating Clay was one of the lesser known architects of the last century, but he had quite a very, very interesting career and biography. He was born in England in 1926, studied there as well as in Zurich. And maybe he's the only architect who really worked for Le Corbusier in Paris, Frank Lloyd Wright here in the US. And he was also heavily influenced by Mies van der Rohe from his time in Chicago, where he worked at SOM. And Mies and SOM basically worked on the same street, in buildings across the street. So he lived in San Francisco from 1961 to 75, where he had a small office, a very, very small office, just a few people. So also his output is very, very limited. You see a short list here, all in a very ultra-modern fashion. So the student union was quite his most ambitious project. So ambitious in a way that it ran into some cost overruns, also some technical difficulties. So the college, the university, took the building away from him before it was even completed. And this was, as you can understand, quite devastating for an architect. So this was enough. He packed his stuff and moved back from Europe, moved back to Europe even before the building was completed. He currently lives in Spain. And actually, the student union was the last building he ever designed. Since then, he has been practicing sculpture and paintings. As far as I know, he never returned really much to the US after 75. An exception was in 2006 when he came back, and there was a tour organized by Docomomo, where the Art Institute and the San Francisco Student Union were kind of part of this tour. You see him there at the bottom. So next slide, please. So what was built was very different than the original design. what was built was really this very three-dimensional walkable sculpture. So one ground floor with uses covered by a big roof terrace, from which these two volumes come up. One is a skylight to an assembly hall, and the other one is this kind of open amphitheater, open theater, facing this main kind of campus ground. All not in a very boxy shape anymore. It's a very kind of cliffed floor plan, so based on this hexagonal layout. So this is definitely a departure from all his previous designs, and also a departure from the modern design canon entirely. So why? It's a good question, and might be partly kind of grounded that it was really built in the 70s now. So the times were different. The students were really heavily participating in the design process. And he said that the design was a result of many, many workshops with students. At the same time, it was a more diverse time in the 70s. So the authority of the modern design language was really over. It was questioned. So all these boxy shapes, they really disappear in the 70s. So what he was built was really a building with many ideas. Some say too many ideas. And if we go to the next slide, we see some of the ideas. Some ideas that reference back to the concepts and philosophy of modernism, but also some that are really very forward-looking, innovative, that we will just see many, many years later. So this roof terrace and this outdoor auditorium could have references to the Tatlin Tower from the Russian constructivists in the 1920s. But then we also see around 2000s, like the Oslo Opera House, where you can walk up and down on the roof, or this open stadia seating that many San Francisco tech companies have these days. Next slide, please. We also, and he's repeating these designs multiple times. So they're not just like, it's more than a collage of ideas. So one interesting design element are these hyperparabolic walls that we haven't seen at all in modern architecture as a wall. As a roof, we might see them. We have the Nervi Cathedral here in San Francisco, but not as a wall. And he's doing it quite nice. He's repeating it, combining it with light, with these skylights, so that the light infiltration is quite nice. And we don't see this at all, this kind of hyperparabolic wall surfaces. Only in the late 90s with these twisting towers it comes back. And we have one example here with the De Young Museum in San Francisco, built in 2005. Next picture. Another design element are these monumental doors, 30 by 30 feet, that are at the two main entrances, that really bring the inside, the students into the building and create a very, very open floor plan or floor environment. At the upper right picture, you see them open here. Down here in the main ones, they are closed. And you see already kind of what happened in the mid-90s. So the upper floor, the roof terrace, was filled in with offices and classrooms. So this definitely changed the appearance and the entire kind of flow of traffic in the building. Next one, please. But if you go around the building, you still see some very, very original elevations. You see here the west elevation as it looks today. You see the framework from this Corbusian kind of cast in place concrete framework filled in with these different kind of volumes. And an interesting detail are also these kind of sculptural open gutters where the rain comes down, an element that architects usually never really want to see. So in here, he really celebrates it. And so if you have time, rain or shine, go and check it out. So there are many, many different ideas in these buildings. So take some time, walk around the building, and here's kind of the comparison from before and now. So if you're there, kind of see if you can find out what is original and what was really added later on. Next one, please. So if you want to see how it looked in the 1970s, so here's a snippet from the streets of San Francisco. This was a TV series, a cop series that was shot in San Francisco between 1972 and 77. And they used all the backdrops in San Francisco. So this was one of the new buildings. So they used it for this one chase episode. The bad guy entered into the building. You see he crosses the open terrace here and runs up, which runs up the open seating, which was not such a good idea. So he didn't really know the building because there's really no way out. So as it is with modern architecture, so it's not really a place for happy endings. So check it on YouTube. There are many episodes posted. And if you look long enough, you will find what these sloped surfaces can be used for. So thank you very much. With this, back to you, Hannah, or if there are any questions.
What a fun and dramatic way to end our presentation.
Yeah, good location scout.
I'm not sure if anyone could hear the sound. It was mostly just like dramatic music and like one person yelling, but definitely check out the other videos on YouTube. It's like pretty cool to see San Francisco at that era. So definitely recommended. Yeah, I want to thank everyone, our other presenters, and also everyone who joined us today. It's really cool to see that a bunch of people joined us from all over the country. I think that, you know, there's some challenges with doing this kind of event virtually. This is definitely new for us, doing the virtual format, but it is really cool that we get to share this stuff with people from all over. So we really appreciate that. And we just wanted to kind of end on this note of why we think the work that Docomomo does and these kind of events are important, which is that already we're seeing that some of the best examples of the 1970s are either under threat or have even been demolished already. So education and documentation are really needed to celebrate these resources and also increase appreciation, attention, and stewardship. And so the map that we created was one way to kind of get the ball rolling on that. And then also, you know, events like this and future tours. And we really look forward to continuing this conversation about the 70s and all its like weird and wonderful design. So if you aren't already a member of Docomomo, we really encourage you to become a member. You can do that through our website or the US website. You can also subscribe to our newsletter there. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram if you want to follow us. And you'll get a survey link after this event, and we encourage you to fill that out. Let us know what you thought, what kind of other events you want to see in the future. And I think we went a little bit over our initially anticipated time, but if there are any questions, we would definitely love to answer any questions there are now.
I see one question here regarding what about Los Angeles?
Good question. Well, so we're the Northern California chapter of Docomomo. So we're, Los Angeles is not in our purview, but there is a Los Angeles chapter of Docomomo Noka, and they've been active recently, and I think that they're doing an event as part of Tour Day. It might not be today, so definitely double check to see when that is. And the LA Conservancy has been doing a big push of advocacy around the 1970s. And so I think that on their website, you can see a lot of 70s resources if you're interested in that, because there are a lot of really good ones down in Los Angeles for sure. Oh yeah, Andrea put a link in the chat box. Thanks, Andrea.
Good.
Any other questions for us now? If you have any other questions that come to you later, feel free to shoot us an email or message us on social media. We got one comment, love that you include the Flintstones house off 280 in the opening images. It was beige to fit into the hillside better back then. Yeah, that's true. the current owner, I think, has only owned the house for a few years, and she really leaned into the like Flintstone house name, which is just like a name that the public has given the house, and repainted it and like put in a bunch of like fun sculptures, and we love that house too. Very cool. Hopefully,
and who knows how it was painted in the and who knows how it was painted in the 1970s, huh? Because I'm sure this received a couple of paint layers by now.
Yeah, probably.
The 70s were known for quite some colorful paints, so I don't mind these new interpretation with a different paint.
Yeah, I think it's a fun way to kind of like get excited about that house. Cool. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think that we'll sign off. If you want to rewatch, or if you joined us a little bit late, we are going to be sharing a recording of the presentation, so watch out for an email with that recording in case you want to go back and rewatch or look at any of the slides or anything like that. So yeah. Thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.